We already went over how large to cut your paper, which is basically the same size as your muslin pieces. And we marked both of them the same way we marked our muslin before we began. So in terms of pinning the fabric onto the paper to transfer your markings, the main thing that's going to be a little different here is what do we do with our front bodice, with our true bias line and everything. You have this whole section that was folded to the back to make the neckline, but for transferring our marks, you want to unfold this excess at the corner here, and you won't actually have to pin anything above that point, but you want to have it unfolded anyways. So to begin, our first pin should be right here, right where your neckline meets the true bias line. So look through the fabric and try to match that point exactly to the lines, and that's where your very first pin should go, okay? Then everything above the neckline, as I mentioned, does not need to be pinned. So we're next just gonna gently work our way down the true bias line. Make sure it's matched up to the line on your paper, and just be very gentle with the fabric at this point. We don't wanna do too much additional stretching or pulling on it unless we're just gently kind of forcing it to match up with the lines on the paper. So I'd say along here, you could pin maybe every 6 inches or so. Okay, so one's right there, one's here, and then I'll do one more just a little bit below my waistline mark. Okay, and next I'm gonna pin along the neckline out to both sides. So also make sure that line is nicely matched. And I'll probably pin once about halfway to the shoulder, and then one more final pin just a little bit outside the shoulder seam markings. And I gotta pull it a little bit just to make sure my lines match. Okay, especially draping on the bias, the fabric is gonna get a little distorted in that process. So just make your lines match. And now we'll smooth up towards the other end of the neckline. And then finally, I'll kind of smooth down and out towards my side seam waist and side seam armhole corners. Pin them both. Maybe one's here at the top of the armhole. I'm just putting a pin in all my corners, and that's probably going to be enough for this particular pattern. Other side. And it's a little tricky. The bigger the paper is, the harder it is to pin sometimes without tearing the paper while you do it. Okay, there we go. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and transfer all my marks, and remember, you're gonna be transferring all the marks you made for the right and left sides. We're gonna need all of these for our balancing process, which is what's gonna come next. So I'll be sure to cross mark right where my shoulder seam meets the neckline, but remember, we don't have to mark any of this. The line is already on the paper. So now I'll just kind of continue getting all the marks, shoulder seam, armhole. At your armhole, just kind of do it in small little rolls, getting each individual dot rather than trying to follow the whole curve. It'll actually be a little more accurate this way. And side seam, waist. Okay, and just kind of same thing down here. I'm just sort of dotting along the waist. Be sure to get the cross mark. Okay, so that's it for the front. Now, back is basically going to be exactly like our other back bodice that we trued before. We just want to match our center back. You can match the fold right with the line, as well as matching your horizontal balance lines. Pin there first. And then pin, honestly, it doesn't usually matter which order you pin, whether you do horizontal balance line and then center back or opposite order, as long as you do those main lines before moving on to any other part of the pattern. So here's my horizontal balance line. Now I'll do center back, just one a little above the neckline. Then down here, match my fabric to the line, pin, pin. Then smooth out towards the corners along your side seam. Okay, and up here towards the shoulder seam. I could just put one pin up here because it's kind of a small area. Okay, and now we're going to transfer all the same marks on the back bodice. So neckline, shoulder, armhole, and get top of the side seam, bottom of the side seam, and then on your waist you want to be sure to get the main portion of the waistline as well as the little cross marks for your dart legs. All right, so come back and go here and here. There we go. Now we'll just unpin, and we have to lightly sketch over all the marks. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do here is I'll sketch over the back separately while you're all working. We're going to kind of break our truing up into a couple parts today. It's a little long, okay? So I'm going to come over to the front, and we're mostly going to focus on the front to start because we need to begin with our balancing, which is actually a whole separate process that happens before any of the actual truing, okay? So the truing is where we're drawing in all of our seam lines, comparing the seam lengths, adding any additional shaping. But balancing is a little different, okay? So unpinned my front, and I have to come in and kind of sketch over all of my marks on both left and right. Okay, so I think I've got everything kind of sketched into place. So about this whole balancing thing, right? We have our whole front, right? We draped the right and left side, but given with how we drape, there's no way that we could possibly get the right and left side totally identical no matter how hard we try. So maybe you're wondering, well, why don't we just fold this in half and take all the marks from the right and just double that over to the left when we cut it, or opposite. Reason for that is, let's say for example, your true balance line was a little bit off, or maybe you draped the right side a little bit kind of more tightly than the left. So this side is maybe a little bit smaller than this side. If we double the side that's too small, then overall the whole bodice is going to be too small across the front. If we pick the bigger side and double that, the whole thing will be too big. So we want to keep the overall dimensions the same. We're just going to average our marks out, and that's what balancing is. Later on, we use balancing more so to balance the front of the garment with the back. That's where it's actually a lot more common, because when we do that type of balancing, it's all about having the side seams hang straight down the side of the body when we look at a garment. Sometimes when you drape something like a skirt, maybe there's too much fullness added to the back and not enough to the front, and you'll see it looks like the side seam is leaning towards the front if you look at the garment on the side. So we do balancing to average that fullness out so that all of our side seams and shoulder seams sit at the right spot. So that's how we're going to be using it a lot later. That's how you'll most commonly see it. This is balancing the right with the left sides so that we, get a well-fitting pattern that's the same on both sides. So to illustrate this, I'm going to bring out a couple different pen colors. That'll kind of help see everything clearly, I think. Okay. All right. What we want to do is we're going to be folding our paper in half right on the true balance line. Okay, so it's basically folding it on the center front. And just to keep it so things don't get a little too confusing, because we're going to be flipping the pattern back and forth a lot, I'm going to real big write R for the right side of the front and L for the left. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to fold the paper right on the true balance line. Okay. And you want to fold it as accurately as possible. Sorry, true bias, not true balance. Too many terms floating around, okay? So get a nice accurate fold. When you're trying to fold a long distance nice and straight, it really helps if you just kind of pinch it at a few spots running down the line and then go back and run your fingers down the fold. Okay. So see how now that just goes perfectly because I've already pinched all those spots. Okay, so we're all folded. Here's my left side facing up. There's the right. What we're going to do is we are going to have the left side of our pattern facing up, and we're going to use our tracing wheel now to transfer all of these lines through to the other side of the pattern, okay? So right now, if I flip it over and look at the right, the original marks that came from the right side, these have already been sketched in place by the pencil. So we're going to our left, and where I have my left side marks sketched in pencil, I'm gonna use my tracing wheel and copy all of them, okay? So the same way you traced it, I'm rolling over all the marks on the left side. And what's gonna happen is when we flip back to the right side of the patterns, you're gonna see a separate set of marks made from the tracing wheel right now that won't have the pencil lines sketched in yet, okay? So be as accurate as possible, right on your marks from the left side. Okay, so there we go. Copied everything from the left. Now, when I flip over to the right side, and I look at my marks, and it may be hard for you to see from where you're at, but I see a second set of little dotted lines that are spaced away from my pencil lines. So the ones that are already marked in pencil are the marks for the right side of the body. The ones that are not yet, that are just the little tracing wheel dots, those are for the left. So to illustrate this a little better, I'm gonna mark each set of marks in a different colored pen. All right, so usually when we're balancing, there's usually just some key points that we balance rather than all the lines, and we kind of draw our lines in between. So the points that we're going to be balancing are basically our corners: side seam waist, side seam armhole, shoulder armhole, and shoulder neck, which is this mark where the shoulder seam meets the fold that we had for the neckline. So I'm gonna go around, and right now in blue, I'm going to sort of cross mark the lines and the marks that were here for the right side already, okay? So right where my pencil marks are. At the side seam waist, I'm gonna make blue is going to be my right side color, okay? So see how I make kind of a little L? That's the waistline meeting the side seam. Now up here, side seam meeting the armhole, just a little L-shaped cross mark. Okay, then up here where the armhole meets the shoulder seam, and then finally just one little straight line where the shoulder seam meets the neckline, okay? So all these little blue marks, those are the ones from the right side of the body. Now I'm gonna grab my green pen. Green is going to mean left today. So I'm going to look for the lines that aren't marked in pencil, the ones that got transferred over from the left side. They're just little dots right now. And I'm going to mark those in green. Okay, so here's the shoulder meeting the armhole. See how now you can probably see a little more clearly, two different sets of marks. Here at the shoulder neck, they're actually very close. I'm gonna put them right on top of each other. Okay, they're basically at the same, so that mark came out pretty good. These are a little different. Here's my side seam at the armhole. And then down here, side seam, let's see, I gotta even lean in close to see that. Here's the waist, okay? There we go, okay? So, now for the actual balancing act, we're gonna look at the two sets of marks and find the middle between all of them. And then we're gonna correct our pattern to have that middle mark be the one that we use for both sides evenly. So I'm gonna come in with my third and final color, which is red. Red's gonna be my balanced marks. These are the ones we're keeping, okay? So I have to look at each little set of cross marks, and some of them will be very close, some will be a little further apart, but I basically wanna measure the distance between them and mark the exact center. Just to give you an exaggerated kind of large scale view down here. Maybe I wanna do another sheet of paper. Let's flip this over, okay? Because I know it's really teeny tiny, so I wanna make sure you can get a really big visual first. So let's say, for instance, here's one mark that is for the right side of the pattern in blue. And then I have another mark that maybe looks like this. That's for the left side, okay? So to balance them, I wanna look at the actual corners where each little set of cross marks kind of meets. Hold your ruler straight across between those two corner marks and measure the distance, okay? Right now I'm looking at a big number of 2.5 inches, but you're gonna see things like 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch. And whatever that measurement is, divide it in half to find the middle. So whatever the middle 2.5 is, that'll be 1 1/4. See, I kind of mark a little dot. This is like the corner of each of these cross marks. And then from there, since it's two seams intersecting, one will be right here and one will be right here. You're just kind of marking right in the middle of the two sets, all right? So that's our large scale version of what I'm about to do. Now I'm just gonna go around and do it in teeny tiny form on the pattern. So here at my shoulder tip, measure the distance between the two little corners. Okay, I have 1/4 of an inch, so I'm gonna mark at 1/8. That's my little corner mark, and you can kind of eyeball the two little legs going off to either side, okay? There it is, right in the middle. That's my balanced mark. Now down here, next one, if I measure between the corners, there I'm getting 3/8. So at 3/16, I'll come and mark here and see the upper leg of them, they're all kind of coming in the same spot. See that? And down here at the bottom, angle it, and see this is like 3/16. You're gonna get some tricky numbers like that, or half of 3/16 is basically 3/32 of an inch. There is no 30 seconds on the ruler, so if you have a number like that where it's an odd number of 16ths, where you can't just easily split it in half, then what you wanna do is take your ruler and kind of move it up to the next 16th of an inch, but hold it kind of evenly spaced over those marks. So you have a little bit hanging over on each end. So instead of 3/16, I'm gonna call this 1/4, but just kind of scoop my ruler so that the 1/4 inch is kind of, straddling between those marks, because then I can mark 1/8 and know that that's kind of the middle. All right, so there's my last balanced mark, okay? Red, red, red. You'll do this one as well. Mine matched up really nicely, so my balanced mark, it's all in the same spot there, okay? All right, okay, where do I wanna start here? I wanna grab my back now. So now we're ready to start using the back. So let me real quickly just go and sketch in my back marks. Back does not need to be balanced in any way because we only draped one side, and we're just gonna, this is going to be a cut 2 for the back of our pattern. Darts. Okay, so back, front. To begin my truing, my favorite first step is to square any of the seams that meet the center back and center front. Anything that's not going to be a point. So down here at my center back waist, gonna go ahead and square the beginning of the mark. Up here at center back neckline, I'll square it as well. Unless you made your back neckline with a V shape, in which case you would not square it, right? Because we don't do it if we have a point. Okay, square, square. And then for your front, you'll want to square where your waistline goes in to the center front, which is our true balance line. And then up here at the neckline, you don't have to do anything. We already have our line for the neckline in place, okay? All right, now we can go ahead and move on to our side seams and compare those. So for the back, real straightforward, you're just gonna draw your side seam. Okay, between the marks that we already have, there's the waist and the armhole. And we're gonna do the same for the front, but now we have to be sure to use the balanced marks that we created, all right? So I did mine in all these crazy colors. You don't have to do it that way. You can still make your marks in pencil, but if you'd like, you could use one colored pen just to mark your final balanced mark in the middle, and that'll give you a really good visual of what you're actually supposed to be working with, because from now on, I'm ignoring my blue and green marks. I'm only looking at the red. So I'm gonna draw my side seam between my red balanced marks, just like that, all right? And we're gonna add our seam allowance right off the bat to the side seam, but we're not gonna cut it yet, okay? We're gonna save our cutting until the end, because for the front, we're gonna be cutting it while it's folded like this. So we're gonna wait until we kinda are a little bit further along. I can still draw it in place though, so side seam gets 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'll add 1/2 inch to the back and 1/2 inch to the front. And now I can compare them. And it's okay that I didn't trim this excess away. I could still come to my back and fold the extra paper under right on my actual seam line. And let's see, do I have my favorite tape? Okay, so we're gonna compare. And let's see, if I just kind of hold it up, matched at the waist, that's actually pretty good in terms of length. So in this case, usually we'd rather match them at the waist and make any corrections at the armhole, because as we mentioned, that's where you're more likely to have made some errors in your marking. My lengths happen to match up really nicely, but remember that even if they do, you still have to attach them together and true your waistline and armhole while they're attached so that we get a smooth, continuous shape. If your side seams are not of equal length, then you already know how to true a full length side seam at this point. We know that our magical measurement from the waist to the armhole is, everyone remember? 8 1/8, yes. So match them at the waistline and make your correction at the armhole so that they are both 8 1/8, okay? I'm just gonna tape that in place and grab my hip curve so that I can true the waistline and armhole. I think I need Frenchie too. Where are you? There, okay. So at the waist, hold your ruler in that upward curve shape and just kind of visualize how it's gonna pass in either direction, just so you can true the bottom of your side seam with a nice shape. At the top, do the same, but use your French curve because it fits the armhole curves a little better. All right, okay. So our side seam has now been trued, and now we can go ahead and just move along to our shoulder seam, okay? So let's detach these. All right, so the shoulder seam, let's go ahead and draw in our back shoulder seam right here. It's just a straight line between your marks at the armhole and the neckline. Okay. And over here on our front, it's going to be between your balanced mark at the shoulder tip and this little mark that's crossing the neckline fold. So there's shoulder seam. Okay. And while we're at it, let's add our 1/2 inch seam allowance to the shoulder seams too. So 1/2 inch seam allowance for front shoulder seam. See how I only have to add it from the neckline fold and downward. And the back, do the same. Now we're going to compare back to front, see if we have to make any changes. So I'm going to take my back, fold the excess paper under so that I'm folding right on the seam line. And we're going to bring it over to compare, as well as discuss what to do if they don't match, okay? So first off, I want to compare here. I'm matching the back armhole to my little balanced mark. See, the other leg of it indicates the beginning of the armhole. So I'm matching them from that point, but now as I look over here at the neckline, what you want is, of course, in a perfect world, we want our back neckline to meet up with the straight neckline that we have for the front, which is really just a fold. It doesn't match. So if your necklines do not match, then there's only one place that you can make the correction properly, and that is going to be at the neckline, but it has to be making the back neckline match the front. This is our fold. We can't change that at all right? So you're gonna match them at the armhole, and your back neckline is really just a style line that you created with the style tape. So if you're matched at the armhole, you're just going to make your back neckline come to meet the same place that you have the fold drawn for the front. So I'm gonna just tape those together. And right here, I could see there's where my neckline is coming into the shoulder seam. So right here, I have to make my back neckline curve to meet that point. So you can use my hip curve or French curve if that fits your neckline shape a little better. And I'm going to draw in the first portion of the neckline, and here I can kind of stay pretty true to my marks, but then I want my curve to go and blend nicely into that new line. So I probably won't hit any of these marks, but that's okay. You can make corrections to your neckline shape as long as it means ending at this exact point. So maybe, let's see. I think, yeah, it's got to scoop in a little bit more than it was before. There, okay, so here's my new neckline, and now it's gonna meet up with the place where the front neckline folds inward, okay? All right, let me see, we did our shoulder seam. Next we can go ahead and true our armhole, which we can do while everything's still attached at the shoulder seam. We want to actually, to make sure that our shape is nice and even. Now, at the armhole, back armhole, you just have your normal set of marks. On the front, we did our balancing at the main corners of the armhole where it meets side seam and shoulder seam, but everywhere in between, it kind of needs to be balanced too. So what's in pencil right now, those are my original marks from the right side armhole. I can see my little dot marks left by the left side. When I transferred it, they're way over here. See that? Okay. So for this, you almost have to kind of eyeball sketching some marks in the middle of those two. It's like we're averaging the whole armhole curve. I would say don't come in with your ruler right off the bat and try to get it exactly in the middle. Kind of look bit by bit, working your way down, and create a new set of sketchy marks as just kind of right in the middle of the two sets that you see. And then you'll come in with your hip curve, or sorry, French curve, I'm mixing up all my rulers today, and true your armhole to this kind of new line you've created in between the right and the left side. It's like we're balancing the whole armhole curve. And I have to be sure to come to my little balanced mark that I created at the side seam. Okay, so that blends nicely. See, it's just cutting right through the middle of everything. And I have to be sure that it also passes my balanced mark right here at the armhole. And it should also go really smoothly into the back armhole. So be sure that you don't end up with a little point where your armholes come and meet each other at the shoulder seam. Right here, it should go straight into the back smoothly. Let's see, that looks pretty good. Okay, smooth curve. And then just true the rest of the armhole, averaging your marks as best as you can. Let's see, it's kind of taking a few positions of the French curve today, but there we go. That looks pretty good, okay? So armhole is trued, it passes through the balanced mark, and we kind of create a whole balanced curve along the whole front part to average out the left and right side marks. All right, you know what, while we're at it, let's add our seam allowances to the armhole and the neckline, okay? Our armhole is gonna have 1/4 inch, just like we've done all quarter, because we're assuming all of these garments are sleeveless, and get 1/4 inch seam allowance on the armhole. I think I'm even gonna go ahead and detach my shoulder seam to do this part. Okay, so looking at my front armhole, I'm going to add my 1/4 inch. Okay, right here. And now same thing for the back, 1/4 inch seam allowance to my entire armhole. I don't like that part, smooth that out. Okay. And after I finish this right up here, we're also going to be adding 1/4 inch to the neckline, but we only need to add that 1/4 inch seam allowance to, wow, I'm really going at it with carrying my paper today. We only need to add the 1/4 inch seam allowance to the back neckline. Our front neckline, nothing is gonna be sewn here. This is going to be a fold. We're gonna have a self-facing where there's basically a large flap of fabric coming to the inside. So this fold is our front neckline, does not need seam allowance. Only come in and add it to the back neckline. Okay, little spot where my seam skipped there. Okay, 1/4 inch. Okay, and next up, we need to true our waist dart on the back. It's been a little while since we trued a dart, right? I think we only did darts in, you know, our basic skirt and basic bodice, so it's been a little while. We have no darts on the front. This is only going to apply to the back bodice. So we're gonna look down here at our cross marks. Here's my dart legs, the little vertical mark, and there's the waistline. We need to true our dart before we can draw the waistline curve. And we're gonna use the same, looking for my pencil sharpener while I talk, there we go. We're gonna use the same standard 7-inch length that we used when we trued the waist dart for the basic back bodice. Basic back bodice, it's a lot of alliteration. Okay, so to true a dart, we need to start by finding the exact center of the dart. So you're gonna come down to the dart excess, the space between your cross marks. Measure how wide that is. Mine's exactly 1 inch. Remember yours should be anywhere between 3/4 and 1.5. I'll mark the center, and then we need to draw a line from this center straight up. Basically draw it up until it hits your horizontal balance line. And for it to be straight up, that means it needs to be perfectly parallel to your center back line. So 2 different ways to do that I'd like to show you. Number 1 is you can take your L square and have it be squared to your horizontal balance line and coming down through the mark in the center, okay? So this is one way to make it be parallel to center back. The other way is you can come in from center back and measure the distance from center back to your mark in the center of the dart. Okay, so if I get this measurement, it's 3 1/4, and then I could come all the way up here to the horizontal balance line, get the same 3 1/4 measurement, mark it, and connect it down straight, okay? So this is where I like to kind of bring in different ways to manipulate your line work that'll still give you the same end result, but different ways to make certain things be parallel or perpendicular to one another, okay? So there's the center of my dart, parallel to center back. And now we're going to establish the length of the dart. And the length of our waist dart is going to be 7 inches, okay? So to make that 7-inch measurement, I want to come to this little cross mark I have right here where the first dart leg meets the waistline. From there, I'm going to begin the 7-inch measurement, but my ruler is going to be angled until the 7-inch mark is touching the center line that I just drew, okay? So this is one leg being exactly 7 inches long. And I can draw right up to there. So here's my 7-inch measurement as it hits the center. From that point, connect it down to your mark on the other side. Okay? So again, this is 7 inches right here. And remember that the point where the 2 dart legs meet, that's called the vanishing point of the dart. That's where your stitch line actually ends when you're sewing the dart. Once we have our vanishing point, we also need to add a drill hole marking. So remember those? We made a little dot with a circle around it, and that's the sewer's indicator of how far to sew the dart. But the drill hole is never exactly at the vanishing point. It's 1/2 inch before it, so that when the dart gets sewn, the drill hole is actually hidden on the inside. So you're going to come to your vanishing point and measure 1/2 inch away from it, back inside the dart. And on the center line, 1/2 inch back, you will dot and circle your drill hole. However, we're not done there with marking it in pencil. This is a new thing that we're going to introduce now. This is a huge point winner or point loser, depending on whether you or not you remember to do it. Your drill holes always need to be marked in red pen, okay? That's a big industry standard thing. We didn't do it when we were just truing directly onto muslin, but when we are making an actual paper pattern, whether it's on dot paper or whether it's finalized on manila, drill holes have to be marked in red. That's the industry standard way of really just calling a lot of attention to that marking. So on your pattern, if there is only 1 drill hole included, there's a section in the rubric for drill holes, and maybe you've seen that we did a few patterns that didn't have any drill holes. Hey, you got some free points there. You automatically get 100% in that area. But if there's only 1 drill hole and you forget to put it all together, you get 0 in that area out of whatever 6 or 7 points it's worth. If you have it in the right spot, but it's not marked in red, you will only get half the points in that area, okay? So always remember to do it because it's a huge way to potentially lose more points than you want to for something really small, but it's considered very big. So that's why I'm making a grandiose speech about it now. Mark your drill holes in red pen. It can be red ballpoint or the red felt tip pen. So once we have that 1/2 inch spacing from the vanishing point, I'm gonna mark my drill hole, nice cute little dot, and circle in bright red pen, okay? Next, for our dart, this is something we also have not done with darts before. Down here at the bottom, this whole space right here in the dart excess, we don't know what shape the pattern is actually doing there, okay? Sometimes you'll see, or I don't know if you have seen yet, maybe in pattern 1, you're given your pattern blocks that already have darts, kind of shaped into them. And you may see that at the bottom of a dart, it has a little bit of a pointed shape, okay? So what this is that when a dart is sewn shut, the flap of fabric on the inside needs to follow the shape of the seam line that it's, going into. So that means as we sew this closed, that flap of fabric needs to be the same shape as the waistline on the inside of the garment. If we just made like a straight line right here between, then when you sew it, it actually wouldn't come far enough down to meet the waist for all the edges of the fabric to line up. And that's what we want, is for all the edges to match, including the bottom of the dart. So here's how we're going to shape our dart. And it's gonna be kind of done in tandem with truing our waistline, okay? As you notice, we have not drawn in the shape of the waistline yet. Let me highlight my dot marks a little bit. When we were truing on our muslin, we pinned the dart closed and then we drew our waistline across it, right? We're going to be doing the same thing. However, our dart is not going to be staying pinned closed on our paper. So stay tuned. It's all coming at you now, okay? We are actually going to fold our dart closed on the dot paper, okay? As we learned with other darts, we know that the dart excess always has to go towards the center of the garment on the inside, okay? So to make that happen when we're folding our paper, we're going to come to the dart leg that is closest to the center, which is this one right here, and we're gonna fold our paper on it. But I only wanna make this fold from the vanishing point down to the edge of the paper. I don't wanna continue the fold up to this end. So, I'm gonna put my paper just like this. Okay, maybe I'll move this out of the way for a minute. Okay. So I wanna begin my fold exactly at the vanishing point and crease the paper exactly on that first dart leg, just like this. See, I'm only folded from here down. I didn't continue my fold up above. Now when I open it up, there's the crease. We need to bring this dart leg over to meet the other one. And if I just kind of come in like this and trying to match them up, things get a little crumpled and weird here because we're trying to take our two-dimensional paper and make it be three-dimensional. So a tip for doing this kind of nice and clean is take some extra object you have that's about this tall. It could be a stapler, tape dispenser, something that you can kind of use to lift your paper. I'm gonna put it under my paper above where my dart is. See the top of my pattern kind of draped over it? And then I'll put the tip of my finger right at the vanishing point. And now look how easy it is to take this fold, and I'm gonna bring it over to meet the other dart leg. Match them up perfectly, just like that. Smooth it out. See that? So my dart is cleanly folded shut. And notice how the fold is only beginning from the vanishing point. Don't let your fold kind of taper way up to here. See, if I remove this, my paper is almost kind of making like a bowl now. So while it is in its closed position, now we can draw our waistline across the bottom. You may see that your waistline marks going across the dart don't perfectly match, but we're gonna correct that right now. So you can either just kind of neatly, you can maybe just hold the dart shut, that's fine. I'm gonna use a little piece of my removable tape to help me out. Okay, so the dart's staying shut, and now we're gonna true our waistline over it. So use the hip curve, have the straighter end going towards center back where your line is already squared, and it's kind of dipping off and down towards the side seam where we already have a little bit of that curve trued. Okay, I may actually use a couple positions of the ruler here because here I'm matched up a lot, and I'm just kind of picking out of these two marks crossing the dart. I'm going with the one that just kind of blends in nicely with the others a little bit more. This one looks a little high. So I'm gonna draw my waistline right over the dart. Okay, so I got up to here. Now I need a slightly different curve of the ruler to blend it to the side. There we go. See, nice smooth waistline. But we're not done, because this is where we're going to do the shaping of the dart excess. Before, when we were truing on muslin, we just kind of ended it here because you kept this pinned when you turned it in. You added your seam allowance and you just cut it right across the bottom, so you never really saw what happened on the inside of the dart. So what you're gonna do is take your tracing wheel, and you're gonna come to this area right here where you have the dart excess folded on the inside, and you're gonna roll over the waistline shape. Just trace the waistline right over this folded area. Just like that, okay? And then when we open the dart back up, okay, it's subtle, but you're gonna look for the shape that the tracing wheel left, which will look like a little bit of a downward point at the center of the dart, okay? So I just kind of lightly sketched it in, but you want to take your rulers now and, make a nice clean line that follows the bottom of the dart. Okay, see the little point in the center. That's what we created rather than just chopping it off to make a straight line, okay? All right, so that's how we true a dart, and that certainly won't be the first time you ever do this. We do a ton of it in pattern 1, okay? So you get plenty of opportunity to review that technique. But now that our dart is trued, we can go ahead and finish up our waistline on the back bodice by adding our seam allowance, which is going to be 1/2 inch. So let's add 1/2 inch seam allowance along the waist. And when I come to my dart with that little pointed shape we created, your seam allowance has to follow that little downward dip, okay? Has to follow it exactly. So see how I draw it right up to the center line, and that's where my ruler then needs to pivot to come up to do the rest. Okay. There we go. See, it follows the same little downward shape right there. What you also want to do while we're looking at the dart, which is going to help when we come in and do our notching, see our dart legs only go down to the seam line. Extend those straight down to the seam allowance because we're going to be putting notches exactly at the dart legs. And if you kind of estimate where they are here, they may not perfectly line up. So it's always better to have your dart legs continue through the seam allowance to help with your notching. So I'm just going to line it up with the dart leg and just draw them through the seam allowance for now. Okay. All right. I think our back bodice is done. Oh, no, it's not. We have one more seam allowance to add. Our center back right here. We always need to think of where our garment is going to open and close. Our whole front bodice is just going to be one piece. Our back, we need to have a separate left and right. We're saying it's a cut 2, and our bodice is going to open up in the back. So we're going to give it the standard 1 inch seam allowance, as if we were going to put a zipper. So just add 1 inch to your center back. And this excess does not get folded under. This is true seam allowance where you'd cut around that shape. So we're not folding this to the back. At the waistline and neckline, just square your seam allowances across that 1 inch area to meet. Here. And here, okay? Okay, now I think the back is done for the moment. So at this point, you are not going to cut out your pattern, okay? It looks like it's ready to be cut, but I'm gonna give you a little bit of work time and then we'll come back for a final meeting where we're gonna be developing a facing for the back. And as part of it, we're gonna sort of cut a duplicate of this piece. So that's why we don't wanna cut it yet. We're gonna be adding another layer of paper and cutting them together. So don't cut out the back. Let me think. Do I want to have you cut the front? I'm just thinking what will be the best order for everything. Yeah, actually, at this stage, oh, we didn't finish our waistline on the front. Let's get that going, and then I'll give you instructions for cutting this out. So down here on the waistline, we basically just have to true our shape and make sure that it comes from our balanced corner down here. Hopefully these aren't off too much to where you'll still be able to make a nice smooth transition between your waistline marks to end at the point where we balanced it. So let's see. Coming from my squared mark at the center, that looks good. And then just end at my balanced mark, okay? And now we'll add our seam allowance to the waist, which will be 1/2 inch. Okay, so all of our seams are in, all of our seam allowances are in. Now to cut this, we're gonna be cutting it while it's folded in half so that all this balancing that we did on the right, when we cut it while it's folded, we're gonna get a perfectly symmetrical pattern, okay? But we also want to take this kind of triangle that's above the neckline and we wanna have this folded downward. We're gonna include what we're doing with that as part of our last little bit on the pattern where we're making facings. This is going to be a self-facing. It's not gonna be a separate pattern piece that you sew on, but it's going to kind of be like a partial lining on the inside of the front. So before you cut, open this up, and you want to take that facing area, that extra triangle above your neckline, fold your paper on the neckline mark that you have. So right on the line, we're folding it this way. And sometimes if you're as aggressive with your pencil strokes as I am, then it'll fold easily because you kind of score the paper. All right, so that's folded down. See, if I look at the bodice from the outside, we're seeing this. But now you're gonna fold it back in half again, like this, so that you're bringing the right and left sides together. And even make sure that that facing area gets cleanly folded in the middle. Okay, be sure that when you fold this, your neckline folds are meeting nicely. Okay, and then while it's folded like this, you are going to be cutting it out. But we have a lot of extra layers. We don't want them to be shifting around while you're cutting and to where we don't get a symmetrical cut. So what I recommend doing is taking your stapler and just kind of staple in a few places around the outside edge of your piece, and that'll kind of stabilize all the layers together for when you're cutting. And since you kind of can't get into close into the edge right here, you could even do like a rough cut with your scissors. Then you can add a few more staples, boom, 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 okay? And then you'll go ahead and cut around the seam allowance lines of the front, all right? So go ahead and take a little bit of time to continue working, and we'll have one final session to go over the facings and the kind of labeling and notching of our patterns, all right? So for this next part here, we're going to be developing our facings as well as just adding our notches and our final labeling for the pattern. So for our back facing, a facing is basically looked at as like a partial lining. We're going to be using our facing to finish off the neckline and part of the armhole, okay? When you have a curved shape like a neckline, we can't finish these types of things by just hemming them. We can't take a curve like this and fold it to the inside. It would just look all lumpy and terrible. So a facing is a really great way to get a clean finish along an edge that has a curve or any sort of irregular shape to it. And it basically means creating sort of a duplicate pattern piece that follows the shape of the edges you're finishing, but then it won't be an entire copy of the back bodice. It'll be cut to be a little bit higher, so it only extends a few inches below the part of the garment that you're finishing on the inside. So as we look at our finished bodice right here, you could see, here's my back neck facing, okay? From the outside, see how nice and clean that looks? It's because we create an actual seam that follows that shape. And then the facing just kind of hangs loosely to the inside of the garment. And for our front, we're doing what we call a self-facing, where rather than having a separate pattern piece to sew along the edge, the fabric just sort of continues and folds to the inside to make its own facing. It's not a separate piece, that's why we call it a self-facing. So starting with our back, we want to cut a duplicate of our back and then we'll shape it from there. So I have a second sheet of paper that's, mine is the same size as my original back bodice. Yours doesn't actually have to be that large. To be honest, you could cut one that's the same size and you really only need like half of that vertical length, but for demonstration's sake, I have it, so it's just the exact same size. I want to staple these two together and I'll be cutting them out together to make that duplicate piece that'll become the facing. But anytime we're doing this, we want to be sure that the grain of our paper is consistent through all the pieces. We don't want to just lay this on top of the other sheet at any angle and cut it out. All the lengthwise grains of the paper pieces have to be in the same direction. So I'm going to look at my extra sheet of paper here and I'm going to give it a center back line that's in the same lengthwise grain direction. And we'll be matching these two lines as we line up the papers and cut the duplicate. So I'm just coming in like 2 inches from the edge of my paper, just like any other back bodice that we're starting off. And I'm going to draw a line that will be my center back, and I'll be matching this up to the center back line of my bodice. Okay, so I just want to look through the paper and match them up. Okay. And I'm matching it to the actual center back line of the bodice, not the seam allowance. It ends up being nicer to match this because then as we see the line left behind on the facing, we know that it actually means something and it's not just ending up being the edge of the piece. We can always say, oh, there's our center back because the line is in the exact same spot. So just make sure your two center back lines are lined up between the layers. And then you're gonna staple the two pieces of paper together. And for this, I'm actually gonna staple a couple places inside the border of the paper as well, okay? So let's see, I got that one there. I wanna make sure they're nicely matched up. Down here, I'll staple kind of on the outside to start, but what we're actually gonna be keeping as our facing is this whole upper neckline and shoulder area. So up here is where I want a couple that are inside the border of the piece, because we wanna keep the two pieces lined up even after we cut them. We want them to be able to stay together, which is why we need some staples on the inside. So I'm just kind of roughly cutting this a little bit closer to my edges. And then now, see, watch out because your dart has a fold in it, so make sure this is nice and smooth. I'm gonna maybe come up to my shoulder seam area and add a staple right there inside the lines. And then maybe one more kind of partway down the armhole. I still didn't cut it close enough here. Okay. Maybe about like that, all right. And then for the rest, you can just do a couple on the outsides, okay? All right, so once I'm stapled, I'm gonna cut the whole back bodice out now, okay? So cut on your seam allowance lines that you've created. And granted, like I said, my paper that I'm using, it's the same length or same size as the main back bodice, so I'm gonna get a full-size duplicate. But as I also mentioned, you're okay if you use a piece that's only half as long underneath, because we really only need to copy this upper area. If your paper doesn't extend to the waist at the bottom, doesn't matter. We actually don't need this portion for the extra copy that we're making. Okay. All right, so there we go, all cut out. So underneath, I have a second copy of my back bodice. Now, while that's still attached, we're gonna go ahead and notch everything now, because even though we're gonna be taking this second layer and kind of shortening it into our facing, whenever you make a facing, it should kind of inherit the same notches that are on the piece you traced it from. So if I notch this while they're still attached, my facing is gonna automatically end up with all the notches it needs. So we're gonna do our notching right now at this stage. Okay, so grab my notcher tool. Okay, so also my front bodice over here, it's still in its folded position. You wanna have it folded while you do the front bodice notches, because we want our same notches to end up on both left and right sides of the piece. So keep it totally folded like this as we notch. First off, we always want to notch the top and bottom ends of our side seams, okay? So notch your side seams. Okay, and remember at the top of the side seam, we're coming into our 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that should just be a little baby notch. The notcher should only go half as deep as the seam allowance, okay? Side seam on the back, and side seam on the front, okay? There we go. Next, we want to notch our shoulder seam. And usually we notch both ends of the shoulder seam, okay? We notch it from the outside and the inside. However, a notch always needs to match up to another notch. And this situation is a little bit different because our front bodice, the neckline edge of that is actually a fold, okay, where that folds to the inside. If we come and notch right here, that actually will just open up to be a hole right in the middle of the folded edge. So we don't want to have a notch at the neckline end of the shoulder seam. Therefore, since we can't have it on the front, we're not gonna add one on the back either, okay? So on your shoulder seams, you're only gonna notch them at the armhole end, okay? And this will also be a little baby notch right in line with your shoulder seam on both. Okay. All right, and next, we want to have notches at the top and bottom of our center back line. So that's going to indicate to us that we have that 1 inch of seam allowance. So at the top, I'll just do the baby notch because it's going into my neckline seam allowance. At the bottom, full size notch, okay? So opposing each other. For my front bodice, I want to have a notch at the bottom end of my center front fold only. We don't want to have a notch at the top here because again, that's just making a hole in the middle of the fabric. But at the bottom, I want to have a notch right here because if I were sewing a skirt on, that would also have a notch at the center front waist to help this become evenly distributed. So unfold your front bodice, go right down to the waist here and notch your center front fold, okay? And granted, that extra layer of paper that is my self-facing, it's extending all the way down to the waist, but we'll be shortening it. So you really only need to notch on the actual bodice layer of paper right here. That extra layer isn't even gonna be covering this area. Okay, so just right there at the waist. And let's see, I think that's actually it for the notching on the front, but taking one more look at the back, we have a dart, okay? Whenever you have a dart, you always need to have notches exactly at the beginning of the dart legs, both of them. And other notches that we create, we try to have them kind of squared to the seam or in line with the seam line. When you are notching dart legs, you want your notches to perfectly follow the angle of the dart legs, okay? So that's why I had you extend them down through the seam allowance so you could really see what direction they're going in. And you're just gonna place a notch exactly on each dart leg, following their direction towards the vanishing point. Okay, all right, so my notches are done. Now let's take a look again at our back bodice. We're gonna unstaple it from the second copy right here, okay? And we're gonna further develop our back facing. So you can take my staple remover out. Yes, I did. Okay, try to not tear up your paper, but you wanna remove the staples to disconnect the two pieces. Okay, so here's back bodice, and here is its evil twin, which is about to become the facing. Okay, so in creating a facing edge, as we call it, which is the sort of loose, unsewn edge that just hangs on the inside of the garment, your general default rule is minimum facing width is 2 inches. That means 2 inches from the seam line that it's actually finishing. So if I was making a really standard neckline facing, I would come and make my facing edge 2 inches lower than the neckline, following the shape. However, we're gonna make a fancy facing. We wanna give our garment what we call hanger appeal, which is something you'll sometimes do when you have a very low front neckline. Have you ever been shopping at the store and you see something on the hanger and there will be some like contrast fabric inside the back neck, or there will be like contrast fabric on the inside of the pockets or weird stitching where only you, the person wearing the garment, will ever see it and nobody could see it from the outside? That's called hanger appeal. It's just cute little tricks to get you to go, ooh, ah, I love this little quirk, I'm gonna buy it, even though nobody else will ever see it but you, okay? We're gonna give our garment some hanger appeal. Since our front neckline is a low cowl, we wanna imagine that if we sewed this, we could have like a decorative back facing. So instead of our facing just being 2 inches wide, we want it to come lower at the center back so that we don't see the raw facing edge from inside when the garment's on a hanger. We see this nice kind of covered, cool contrast fabric or whatever you would imagine making it out of. So our facing is gonna be longer at the center back than just standard 2 inches. You are going to make your facings 6 inches long at the center back. So you're gonna come to your copy of the back bodice, and these measurements include the seam allowance, okay? Our seam allowance is already factored in here from when we made the copies. So from the outermost edge of your paper at the neckline, measure straight down on center back and mark 6 inches, okay? And see how I'm just kind of squaring it to the center back and the seam allowance? 6 inches down. Our facing is also gonna kind of curve up and it's gonna veer off into the armhole a little bit, okay? So it's gonna have a very interesting shape. So to create this portion, you're gonna come to the top of the armhole right here, measure down 3 inches and make a little mark. Okay, so just 3 inches down from the top of the armhole. Mark it, okay? And I'm gonna start by just I'm gonna like freestyle this curve a little bit and then come in with my rulers to true the shape. So what we wanna do is, from this 6-inch mark where it's nice and squared right here, keep that going straight for a little ways and then kind of scoop it up. Okay, you don't wanna curve up too abruptly. We want it to be wide enough before it comes upward. So I'm just kind of curving it. And then right here, it's gonna sort of curve inward and wave downward to meet. So we have this kind of wavy S-curve shape happening, right? And once we get it kind of mapped out like that, then you could come in with either hip curve or French curve, whatever floats your fancy, and just kind of true this nice, pretty shape. Okay, just make sure that you have smooth connections on all your curved segments, okay? And once you have that line created, you're gonna cut on that line because we don't need any of this lower section for our facing. This is just to create a finished edge along our neckline and give us a cool little view of the inside of the garment when it's hanging on the hanger. Okay, so just like that. And then this, the lower part, we don't need this. That's done with, okay? So this is your finished back facing, okay? And it automatically has all the notches it needs, okay? So, back bodice, back facing. Now we have to take one more final look at our front bodice and develop the bodice's self-facing, okay? So, where did my front bodice go? Here we are. All right. So you're gonna take your bodice, unfold it, and we're taking a look at now the flap that's on the inside. We're gonna turn this into our self-facing. We don't want it going all the way down to, the waist area on the inside. We're gonna cut this shorter and curve it off also toward the armhole so that from the outside, we just have this nice fold and it comes down a little ways on the inside, all right? To do this, we want to end up with our facing shape being symmetrical on the inside, so we really only have to draft this on half of it, and then we'll cut it while the piece is folded, so it ends up nice and symmetrical, okay? So you're gonna come right here to the fold that is your neckline, and at the center front, you wanna measure down, honestly, I'm gonna give you a little bit of a range, 4 to 5 inches. Anywhere within that amount is pretty good, okay? So I'm just gonna split that difference. I'm gonna go with 4.5 for mine. I'll measure 4.5 down right on that true bias line, which is also the center front, and I make a mark. And from there, honestly, it doesn't matter which side you draft this to, okay? We're gonna make it the same on both. I wanna square it over for a good distance to one side, okay? So this is squared to the true bias line. And then we're gonna establish the point where it's gonna curve up a little bit and go into the armhole, kind of like our back facing did. So go to your front armhole and measure down 3 inches also. Okay. And this type of facing, it doesn't always have to go into the armhole, but with the way we're sewing this, it actually makes it easier and it gives you one less thing as part of your truing process, believe it or not. Because if we made this come up and kind of cut away in the shoulder seam, then as we make our back facing, we have to true the length of the shoulder in the facings as well. This gives us one less thing to do. So it's gonna veer off into the armhole. Okay, so it's 3 inches down, and this is just from the outermost edge of the paper. It's including all our seam allowances. There's my 3 inches. So now from here, I can kind of, just like on the back, we're kind of freestyling this. I'm gonna curve it inward and then gently wave into the end of the line I already have. Okay, so it's just a subtle up. We just don't want to make it a totally straight line. It should scoop upwards a little bit. And then you'll just come in with your rulers and true the shape, okay? Just be sure that your wave doesn't dip lower than the part where it crosses the center line. All right, so there it is. I only have it drawn on half, and that's fine because now to cut it, you're gonna unfold the neckline of the bodice, and now you're gonna fold it back in the opposite direction on your true bias line, like this, okay? So now we're bringing the left and right sides together, and while it's like this, you'll cut on the line that we just drew, and it's gonna shape your facing symmetrically between the left and right sides. Like that, okay? So now when we open up our whole piece, it looks kind of crazy, but this is our entire pattern piece, all right? When the garment is sewn, this gets folded to the inside, and while it's hard to show on paper, this is the part that makes the lovely drape at the neckline, and the facing kind of comes on the inside and just hangs out loose. And sometimes that'll be finished on the inside with even just like the overlock stitch. Sometimes it'll even be left raw because we don't want to have too much of an impression of that edge coming through from the outside. So it's usually kept pretty low profile. It just hangs off on the inside, all right? Okay, so let's go ahead and just get our pattern labeled, and then I'll just give you 1 or 2 tips about the sewing, and we're good, okay? So for labeling, we have 3 total pattern pieces. Let's get everything all unfolded, okay? Our back bodice and back facing, they're each gonna get their grain line 1 inch away from the center back line. So that's this line right here, not the seam allowance. Come 1 inch inward. Grain line. Same thing on the facing. That's our center back. See how it's nice that that's the line that we kind of lined up when we copied this? Come 1 inch inward from it. And grain line. Now, on your front bodice, this is gonna be a little weird, okay? This is where the bias thing can sometimes get a little confusing. So really make sure you pay attention to this part, as well as when you're cutting your pattern on the fabric. Our grain line is not going to be in this direction. It's not gonna be on our true bias line, okay? We want our grain line to follow the lengthwise grain of the paper, okay? So you're gonna look at your paper and look at the rows of numbers, find the direction where the numbers are the same. So here, 444, 555, that's my lengthwise grain direction. So I want my grain line to be in that direction, all right? And it's gonna go kind of right across the middle of the piece. So I wouldn't, pick this row down here and draw a grain line all short. You want the longest grain line possible. So see how this row of 5s, I'm going kind of right, a nice big diagonal through the whole piece. Okay, I matched up to that row of numbers in my lengthwise grain direction. Nice long grain line. Okay. So, purpose of this line, while you see the pieces kind of laid out like this, and we imagine this is how the garment hangs, when it's cut on your fabric, and imagine you have your fabric with the lengthwise grain running this way, here's your selvages, right? This piece will be like this on the fabric, okay? When you cut your pattern pieces on the fabric, all the grain lines that you mark should always be in the lengthwise grain direction of the fabric. So this front bodice will look like it's quote unquote diagonal on the fabric when you cut it. And that's so that it ends up with the fabric being cut on the bias as well. If you go to cut your fabric and you have your front bodice sitting this way, with your lengthwise grain going like that on all the pieces, your front bodice will just end up with the lengthwise grain up and down, and it won't have that same lovely drape that we created from having it hanging on the bias. And it will actually be too tight across the body as well, because you don't have that flexibility going sideways and up and down that we get from the bias, okay? So really remember that, and I'm also gonna, in a moment, point you at a photo that will help kind of illustrate a little bit more, because that's the most common mistake I see with this. Everyone will drape it correctly on the bias, they'll label their pattern like this, and then when they cut it on the fabric, they'll cut it in this direction and the garment basically isn't on the bias anymore, okay? So all of your grain lines should all be parallel to one another and to the lengthwise grain. When you cut, this piece will look diagonal in relation to the others. All right, so for our labeling, let's go ahead and label big front bodice first. Okay, now for where to put your information, you could either kind of have it nice and centered on the piece or a little bit more right here where it's kind of on the right side of the bodice. So I think I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna label right in this area. Piece title is going to be front bodice. Size 8. This is only a cut 1, okay? Because we have the entire left and right side of the piece all in one. It's just a cut 1. And your name. Okay. Back bodice. Okay. Piece title is back bodice. Size 8. Back bodice is going to be cut 2. We have a separate left and right so that we can have a closure in the back. And your name. And then finally our back facing. Piece title is back facing. Size 8. Back facing is also a cut 2, just like the back bodice. And your name, okay? So this is our completed pattern, okay? And let's see. You're gonna be turning in your entire pattern next week, as well as you will need to cut and sew your entire cowl neck bodice. But don't worry, the sewing on this is so much faster than the whole dress you just created. It's actually very few steps. The only really tricky part, well, you really want to be sure you pay attention to the sewing instructions, is sewing the shoulder seams. Seems like it would be, straightforward, but since our front bodice has a fold and this has a seam, we do it in this interesting way where, see how it's clean on the inside and the outside? Everything gets sandwiched in kind of an interesting way in the front, so really kind of observe the photos on how the shoulder seam is set up. And other than that, sewing is pretty simple, okay? Remember to do all the stay stitching that's indicated, like on the armholes as well as even the waist. We stay stitch just as an indicator of here's the actual seam line on the garment, and your center back as well will be stay stitched at 1 inch for the closure location, okay? So just to give you a little extra visual, I want to show you, I pulled up on Canvas. This is in your module for this week. Remember I have these homework links that are posted. When you click on them, you're going to see a ton of example photos. A lot of them are there because of the way that we taught it for remote teaching. I had a lot of example photos. And for all of the sewing assignments, for the sewn garment ones, see where you create the entire finished bodice, because I had no way of really seeing the fabric up close to be sure that students cut it correctly on grain, I would give them example photos of how I would like them to photograph their pattern pieces sitting on the fabric, so I knew it was correctly on grain. But you can use those to your advantage as well, because here is where I was kind of illustrating what angles the pieces should look like when you cut it on your fabric. And what I also did here is, since the front bodice is only a cut 1 and these are both cut 2, I only folded over a small section of the fabric right here for the back bodice and the facing to be on, so those get doubled. And then the front bodice is just on a single layer, and everything will kind of fit nicely next to each other, all right? So when you're folding over that small section for the back pieces, you only have to fold over enough to fit right here, but you have to make sure that even your fold is parallel to the selvage. So fold over a small area and measure the distance between the selvage and your fold at 2 places so that you're not folding it at a weird diagonal angle, okay? So just want to really kind of drive it home what direction this piece needs to sit when you cut it on the fabric, okay? Or else it won't end up on the bias anymore when you sew it. After you cut, then of course you'll be sewing, and I have a similar style of photo instructions, just like we have with this last dress, on how to sew it together. And you will come to class next week with your lovely bodice and pattern all completed.